Implantation bleeding. It's one of those things that can pop up during the early stages of pregnancy, and while it's a perfectly normal occurrence for some, it can often be mistaken for something else, like a light period. So, let's break it down, understand what it is, how it happens, and why it matters. First off, what exactly is implantation bleeding? In simple terms, it's light spotting or minor bleeding that happens when a fertilized egg attaches itself to the lining of the uterus. This typically occurs about 6 to 12 days after ovulation, which is right around the time many women would expect their period. So, it's no wonder that confusion reigns. Not every woman will experience this, and that's perfectly okay. For those who do, it's usually a sign that the pregnancy is establishing itself. Now let's get into the biology of it. After ovulation, if an egg gets fertilized by sperm, it forms what's called a zygote. This zygote then goes through a series of rapid cell divisions and becomes a blastocyst, which is essentially a tiny cluster of cells ready to implant itself into the nutrient-rich lining of the uterus, the endometrium. During this process, the blastocyst can disrupt small blood vessels in the endometrium, leading to that light spotting we call implantation bleeding. According to Dr. Mary Jane Minkin, a clinical professor of obstetrics at Yale, this disruption is minor. We're talking light spotting, not a heavy flow like you would see during a menstrual period. So, what are the characteristics of implantation bleeding? Timing is key. It happens between 6 to 12 days post-ovulation, which, as we mentioned, can overlap with when you'd expect your period. The color of the bleeding can vary from pink to brown, definitely lighter than the bright red blood you might associate with your menstrual cycle. And here's another important point. Implantation bleeding usually lasts only 1 to 2 days. In contrast, a typical period can last anywhere from 4 to 7 days. Now, some women report mild cramping or a pulling sensation in their lower abdomen during this time. But let me emphasize that these cramps are generally much less intense than the cramps associated with a regular menstrual cycle. So, if you're experiencing heavy bleeding or severe pain, that's a red flag. It's always best to consult with a healthcare provider. Now, how do you differentiate implantation bleeding from your period? There are a few telltale signs. First, the volume is a big clue. Menstrual bleeding typically involves a steady and significant flow that requires regular use of pads or tampons, while implantation bleeding is much lighter and may only require a panty liner. Additionally, menstrual blood often contains clots and tissue fragments, while implantation bleeding is more uniform in texture. Another important distinction lies in the symptoms. Menstrual periods often come with premenstrual syndrome, PMS. Symptoms like bloating, mood swings, and fatigue. In contrast, implantation bleeding might be accompanied by early pregnancy signs like nausea, breast tenderness, or increased urination. Now, let's talk about the significance of implantation bleeding in confirming pregnancy. While it can be an early sign of pregnancy, it's not definitive. Dr. Zev Williams from Columbia University advises that if you suspect you're experiencing implantation bleeding, the best course of action is to take a home pregnancy test. By the time implantation occurs, levels of HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin, may be detectable in your urine, providing a more reliable confirmation of pregnancy. It's also essential to address some myths and misconceptions surrounding implantation bleeding. For instance, not all pregnant women experience it. Studies suggest that only about 15 to 25% of pregnant women report spotting during this time. And contrary to some beliefs, implantation bleeding is not heavy. If you're experiencing heavy bleeding, it might indicate other issues, such as a miscarriage or ectopic pregnancy, which definitely warrants medical attention. Another myth is that implantation bleeding is painful. In reality, it's usually painless or associated with only mild cramping. Severe pain could suggest other complications that need to be evaluated by a healthcare professional. So when should you seek medical advice? While implantation bleeding is typically normal, there are certain symptoms that should prompt a call to your healthcare provider. If you experience heavy bleeding that resembles a period, severe pain or cramping, dizziness or fainting, or persistent spotting beyond a few days, it's time to get checked out. Dr. Marjorie Greenfield, an OBGYN, emphasizes that any bleeding during pregnancy should be discussed with a healthcare provider to rule out complications. From a clinical perspective, distinguishing implantation, bleeding from other causes of early pregnancy. Bleeding can be challenging. A detailed menstrual history, physical examination, and blood tests. Measuring HCG levels can help in diagnosis. Research has shown that implantation bleeding is generally lighter and shorter than bleeding associated with hormonal irregularities or early pregnancy loss, providing some reassurance. For women undergoing fertility treatments like in vitro fertilization, IVF, spotting after embryo transfer may resemble implantation bleeding. However, this is often due to procedural irritation rather than actual implantation. So, what practical tips can I offer to help you navigate this? First, track your cycle. Understanding your menstrual cycle can help you distinguish between implantation bleeding and your period. Pay attention to other symptoms you might be experiencing, like nausea or breast tenderness, and don't hesitate to use reliable tests. Home pregnancy tests are quite accurate, and follow-up blood tests can confirm pregnancy with high accuracy. Lastly, if you're ever in doubt about whether your bleeding is normal, reach out to a healthcare provider for personalized guidance. In conclusion, implantation bleeding is a natural part of early pregnancy for some women, yet it's often overlooked or misunderstood. By understanding its characteristics and significance, you can navigate your reproductive health with more confidence. Remember, knowledge is power. By tracking your cycles and consulting reliable sources, you can differentiate between implantation bleeding and other causes of bleeding, ensuring a healthy start to your pregnancy journey.